So there's a lot of things. There's a lot of things to talk about in the next week and a half. And let's begin, therefore, by noting the first thing, the changing nature of international security. Because, you know, as much as I'm going to betray my own personal biases, it's always good to look at the world first with good old-fashioned harsh anti-agreeablism. It at least gives you an overarching assessment of the situation. The first thing to understand is that with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the bipolar system of power effectively breaks up. And for about 10 years, the world is structured within a unipolar system. The United States is the sole remaining kid on the tire playground. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to remain on top permanently. Because realists correctly argue that unipolarism is in fact the most dangerous and most unstable power arrangement. Because those that are just one step below you either A, want to remove you from your alpha position, or B, simply want to join you in that alpha position. However way that it works, the lone wolf realizes that they're on borrowed time. And we see the first thing that we see with the collapse of the bipolar system is that the world does not enter a period of perpetual peace. In many situations, violence resumes in many places in the world that we had thought long since fixed and solved. What Nye and others have correctly pointed out is that since 1989, since 1990, since those years of transition from when the Cold War ended, there has been an explosion of conflicts around the world. But the overwhelming majority of those conflicts have been intrastate. They've been internal problems. And in the olden days, internal problems were never considered to be the business of international studies. There's sort of this unwritten rule that if you commit crimes against humanity inside your own borders, that's your own problem to deal with. The minute that this goes over into another country, the minute Iraq invades Kuwait, we give a damn about what Saddam does. Right? The minute Germany invades Poland, we give a damn about what Hitler does. But the minute that, the minute you fly planes into a building, we suddenly give a damn about the Taliban. But prior to that, you keep it within your borders, no one really cares. What is becoming increasingly obvious by the mid to late 90s that you can't really ignore these problems anymore, because they are not really internal. They look internal, and they may function for the most part internally, but because of the breakdown of borders in many parts of the world, especially in the Balkans, the Caucasus, the former Soviet Union, not to mention the rise in communication, the ease in communication from one geographic area to another, internal problems are almost always supported by external proxies. So if there is a civil war going on in Bosnia, you know that Croatia and Serbia are involved. If there is a conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, better yet, if there's a conflict between Armenians in Azerbaijan, you know that Armenia itself is giving direct support. And you also know that if the Azerbaijanis are actually holding their ground against the Armenians, they're getting support, weapons, and political, diplomatic support also from Turkey. So in many situations, the problem that we see with these internal wars is that they run the risk of deteriorating security within a region. And this is where Mearsheimer's article comes in. This is where many of the early realist pessimists come in the early 1990s, that bemoan the collapse of the bipolar system. They're like, the bipolar system was the best thing out there because just by the power arrangements, conflicts were frozen. With the absence of the Soviet Union and a whole bunch of countries now claiming democracy without actually being ready for it, you end up getting into all of these little conflicts that are based on land, territory, arguments over where the border should go, grievances over what had taken place 40, 50 years ago, or hell, even 500, 600 years ago. Okay? So this is where we kind of get to our Back to the Future scenario, in that the immediate years following the collapse of the bipolar system risks kind of readjusting the power arrangements, most likely to a multipolar arrangement, much to the detriment of the United States. Within this conflict, the international arena becomes more and more salient, particularly the United Nations. People are looking at the atrocities going on in the Balkans, the Caucasus, the Middle East, Rwanda, Somalia. People are not so much looking to the United States to help. They're looking to the United Nations to say, what the hell are you here for if you're not going to do anything? And it is within the United Nations that major powers, like the United States, Great Britain, Germany, and when they get their act together, even Russia, can use the UN for furthering their own strategic interests, specifically when it comes to intervening. Because this is also another question that nobody had really asked during the Cold War. When is it legal, when is it appropriate for another country to intervene into the affairs of a first? And more to the point, is it legal? Is it moral? No, I don't use the two words as synonyms. Is it moral or is it legal for an external country to intervene in the affairs of an internal problem of another country in order to stop genocide, ethnic cleansing, minority discrimination, or other signs that feel like things could spiral into more international conflicts? Particularly when these wars are waged not on any kind of ideological scale. This is the thing. Democracy is really now the only game in town. No one's fighting in the name of communism. Fascism is not making a comeback, right? The monarchies are not giving another shot. A lot of these conflicts are actually done because of democratization. But democratization that mobilizes people along ethnic and cultural lines. That's the reason why you see this explosion of conflict in the 1990s, where people seem to be killing each other based upon the language that they speak or don't speak, the god or gods that they worship or don't worship, or the historical memory that they ascribe to or reject. And so it's a few flashpoints that we see, right? The world does not become any safer after the Soviet Union collapses. As a matter of fact, the first thing that we note is that there is a huge potential for a security dilemma in the former Soviet Union, with the breakup of the country into 15 succeeding states. Now, some are a little bit more organized than others. Those at the top, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These are what we would call the Baltic states. They had independence during the interwar period. They have some kind of experience with democracy, and they were one of the first to openly challenge the hegemony of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and successfully break away. Today, all three of these countries are in NATO, and they are in the European Union. When we talk about the Soviet Union, we oftentimes interchange Soviet Union with Russia. And that's not entirely appropriate, but be that as it may, Russia is the largest country out there, and Russia kind of inherits all of the problems, all of the legacies, all of the whatever that is the Soviet Union. With that in mind, other countries that break away, Belarus, Moldavia, Ukraine, and Georgia, see their early independence as more antagonistic towards Russia, as a way of moving away from them and gravitating towards Europe, gravitating towards the democratic West. There's only one problem. The governments may want this. People who live there have ambiguous feelings. Not just because of the fact that there are ethnic Russians that live in the area, and that's not to suggest that Russians just by ethnicity are hostile to the West, but it does imply that the breakup of these countries involves a whole bunch of people who may or may not be happy living in a country that they didn't vote for. Especially if you find yourself suddenly, one morning you wake up and you're part of an ethnic minority. This is even more apparent in the Caucasus, between Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And anything that usually ends in stan, well, these are places that have never been countries beforehand. Suddenly we find countries like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan find themselves independent without any kind of discernible identity. Oh, and here's the other part. They have nuclear weapons as well. I find that nice, right? We don't want that. We don't want that at all. It's not that Kazakhstan is going to wage nuclear war with the world and suddenly take over. But these countries are, in fact, economically weak and politically unstable. And the biggest fear is not that these countries may use nuclear weapons, but that nuclear weapons could fall potentially into the hands of rogue movements, rogue governments. Later on, we'll come to know them as terrorists. So suddenly, the collapse of the Soviet Union may not be as happy and as organized as we had thought. When we look even further into the Caucasus, because most people think that the violence takes place in the Balkans. The Caucasus are a mishmash of ethnic groups that are living on this side of the border, that side of the border. They have no border, they want a border, they want to get rid of a border, whatever it happens to be. The primary elements within these three countries are Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. But you also have a number of ethnic communities that live along the Russian border regions. You may have heard of Chechens, or Dagestanis, or Ingush. These are people who have noted that the Soviet Union breaks up into these various constituent republics, and those ethnic groups caught on the other side of the border and don't get a state want one. Hey, if Azerbaijan can get a country, so can Ingushetia. Hey, if Turkmenistan can get a country, so can Chechnya. And Russia is suddenly engulfed in a series of secessionist wars. And remember, Russia in the 1990s is nothing like Russia of the 2000s. This is before Putin comes to power. This is Boris Yeltsin, a man who was lauded in the West for being a harbinger for democracy, but was increasingly ridiculed at home for being a buffoon. And a man who effectively sat over the demise of the last elements of the Soviet Union. The Red Army fails to contain the violence in Chechnya and Dagestan to the point where it's a national embarrassment for the Russians. What's more so is that the Chechens are getting money, weapons, and supplies from Central Asia as well as from the Middle East. So all of these regions create potential flashpoints that could, if left unattended, create larger regional conflicts. And the last thing that we really want is for a country like Armenia and Azerbaijan to be at war, because Armenia will bring in Russian support, Azerbaijan will bring in Turkish support, and whenever the Turks get mobilized, it's already too late. Okay? Because the minute Turkey gets mobilized, how far does it go? Iran mobilizes, Iraq mobilizes, and before you know it, everything spirals out of control. With even more specifics, let's take a look here with the border conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This is something that we're going to be talking about a little bit more on Wednesday. Armenia and Azerbaijan have technically been at war since the early 1990s. Armenia controls about 10% of Azeri territory in a region that is known as Nagorno Karabakh. Nagorno Karabakh is an area in which ethnic Armenians predominantly live, but after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they find themselves on the wrong border. They find themselves as minorities in another country and subjected to a series of minority discriminatory policies. The Armenians decide to mobilize in a period before Azerbaijan gets its act together, and the area that is within the darker brown is the actual region of Nagorno-Karabakh, which Armenia claims for itself. But obviously, if we're going to claim some territory, we might as well take a whole bunch of other areas as well. To this day, Nagorno-Karabakh is, for the most part, a de facto separate state. It has no international recognition, and numerous attempts by the international community to come up with a peaceful solution to the region between Yerevan and Baku have in fact failed. Turkey supports Azerbaijan, Russia supports Armenia, and the area remains a frozen conflict. Less so in the Balkans. In the Balkans, the one country that actually gave communism a reputable name, the one country that actually made communism almost hip to live in, Yugoslavia, breaks up in the early 1990s as well, as a whole bunch of smaller level republics declare their independence. To this day, there are 6 states that have emerged out of Yugoslavia and 1 territory. Slovenia in the north, Croatia in red, Bosnia in gray, which itself is divided between 2 territorial entities, Serbia in blue, Montenegro in yellow, Macedonia in orange. And then, as I mentioned, Kosovo, which is nominally part of Serbia. It did declare independence in 2008, but it is still unrecognized in the United Nations, so I just simply recall it as a territory. But even here, the ethnic composition it's just going to give one a headache to look at. The reason why the wars of secession do bring out is because when Yugoslavia breaks up and all these little internal boundaries begin to crop up, you find that ethnic groups find themselves on the wrong side of the border. And the national policies of these succeeding states are definitely ethnocentric, particularly in Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia, which alienates ethnic minorities within those countries. Ethnic Serbs in Croatia and Bosnia, ethnic Albanians in what would be Kosovo. So the point here is that things are messy. They're messy. The international community is trying to find ways of solving these problems. And at the end of the day, problems are not so much solved as they are put in perpetual stasis. So let's then take a look a little bit more analytically about how these security threats are defined. First of all, most of these issues have resulted in some kind of conflict, some type of mobilized conflict. And I've already alluded to the larger issue of political vacuums coming out of regions of the world. The Soviet Union and Southeastern Europe are certainly the case. We haven't talked yet about the Middle East. The Middle East also flares up, not only between Israelis and Palestinians, but between Iraq and its neighbors, Egypt and its neighbors, Libya and its neighbors, and now, of course, Syria. Issues surrounding things like where the border goes. If countries are going to be declaring their independence, and certain segments of that population do not want to be in this newly independent country, seeing as how we are redrawing the borders, why don't we just be a little bit more micro-analytical and draw the border of the new country that does not include that one group of people? No, we're not going to do that. We're not going to arbitrarily draw borders. This is an actual paradox, is that over the past 25 years, borders have been redrawn in a number of countries, but they are redrawn by simply looking at the internal borders that divided a country by province or region. So it's kind of like in a parallel universe, the United States breaks up. There's regions of the world, there's regions of the country that want to break up. But rather than redrawing borders to, this is the New South, this is what we would call flyover Stan, this is, New England or whatever it is, what we end up doing is we use the existing borders of the states to simply say, that's the new border. Right? That's the new border. Okay? Rather than drawing new borders. So on one level, borders are sacred. We don't touch them. Even though most borders of countries today, most sovereign borders are in fact man-made creations at some point over the past 250 to 300 years. Unless you're like an island like Japan or Iceland, then it's pretty self-evident. Okay? Mobilized communities within these countries are oftentimes taking matters into their own hands before the central government can even react. That's why many of these countries that are succeeding authoritarian regimes, particularly communism, don't have a huge degree of legitimacy. They oftentimes take control of the country before they really take full control over the country. They're just the guys that are in power. And they have little recourse to handle matters. In many cases, the public drags them into a conflict. Or better yet, they're too busy responding to what a neighboring country does. This is another thing that IR Studies has begun to look at most recently. And that is actually the dangers of democratization. Now, you take a civics class, you take nature or politics, you tend to think democracy is the best thing in the world. Right? Democracy is the best government there is out there. And, it's not bad. It's not great. It's not bad. It's not, But the problem is, and this is something that sounds a little elitist. Okay, I'm going to say this early on. It sounds a little elitist. But when we look around the world and we're like, countries are going to become democracy or democratic, you apply democratic peace theory. Right? Immanuel Kant's vision is coming to life. You come away by looking at the world and say, some countries do transition to democracies better than others. Some countries just make that switch and we're all good. And other countries seem to have a problem with democracy. That has led to a number of analysts and policymakers here in the United States making a number of rather controversial conclusions. On one level, you can look at the writings of Fareed Zakaria, whom I kind of love and hate, depending upon my mood. But Zakaria, how many of you have heard of Fareed Zakaria before? Yeah, I didn't think, okay, good. Fareed Zakaria has long argued that some countries, some societies, are just simply not ready for democracy. You know, democracy involves a certain advanced degree of development. It involves a certain modernization, so to say. And some countries are just simply not ready for it. You know, you can bake a cake. Look, you know, the recipe says to bake a cake. You know, bake for 3 hours at 250 degrees. Well, I can't do it for 3 hours. You know what? I'll do it for 500 degrees at an hour and a half. That doesn't work like that. Oftentimes, democracies take a lot of time to develop. In some countries, democracies happen before the state is ready. Other policymakers, like Sam Huntington, even go even further by saying that it's not even that some countries are not ready, but some cultures, some societies are just simply incompatible with democracy. It's not part of their culture. It's not part of their history. It's not part of their identity in that regard. So, the outbreak of war in various parts of the world, which, when you look at it initially, and, you know, CNN is notorious for looking at things initially, and only initially, okay? They're still doing it today. You're led to believe that, you know, people who are fighting over in Bangladesh are basically doing something because they hold a grudge against these other people that go back about 700 years. Okay? And you begin to think, oh my God, ancient hatreds and all these other things are just tearing people apart. Not like us in the good, waspy West type of thing. You know? That's not entirely true. In fact, that's hardly true. The point that I'm trying to make here is that we look at this and we think to ourselves, obviously, some countries should not become democracies. Even more to the point, some countries need Western support. Need Western support in order to make that transition. Otherwise, they're just going to kill each other.